Transformative business is about combining activism with entrepreneurial endeavors. So what I always say to my students is we have to be disruptors. Entrepreneurs have the freedom to create the world in which we inhabit. So it's simply not about profit. In transformative business, we actually try to become influencers and changers. So in a very strict definition, that would be something akin to a B corporation in the US. We have companies like Patagonia or Ben & Jerry's that systematically say, well, 10% of our profits go towards particular social causes, and we determine what they are. But it can also be something like saving the ocean, the plastics project, where recycling becomes a kind of like a motive of saying, you know, we are transforming something that was once garbage, we're reducing garbage, we're creating a new product out of it. So it's along those lines. We try to think in terms of solutions in transformative business. So I try to combine activism with everything I do. This is actually going to be a discussion about activism today, not so much academia. And I'm so honored to be here, and thank you so much to the organizers, in particular Rina, who invited me. I also participated in the summer school open set this year, so I see many friends, and it's very nice to be in the company of people who are very interested in actively changing the world. I have been living in this area for 10 years in Southeast. I am very much interested in the transformation of this area as a social space, and I've watched it change in the time I've been here. I spent 2 years working at Heesterveld, which is the project I'm going to talk about a little bit today in relationship to this concept. It's kind of where I formulated the notion of ghetto romanticism. And I'll discuss later where I'm currently at in my activism, because it's a very different population I work with. But I would like to say a few things just to kind of contextualize this conversation so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. As I said, I'm not going to speak as an academic. This is more of a discussion about activism and how we could possibly influence conversations. So I want to start out by saying that I'm not a romantic at all. I don't really think romanticism is a very healthy thing at the moment. If we listen to the Swiss-British philosopher Alain de Botton, he says we are living in the age of romanticism. And the problem with that is that our cues come from the outside world. So we, in his imagination, are living in a state of dissatisfaction. But to me, it's more of a hyper-reality. Something that doesn't actually exist but is fabricated by consumer culture and by television and the imagery that we encounter. Here you see, these are images, this is the same image 4 times, which is sort of in this notion of repetition and rhythm. I'm arguing that tropes have become a rhythm in Amsterdam Southeast, and a potentially dangerous one, at least one that should be problematized because they're actively incorporated into social and political agendas. So in no way am I speaking about hip-hop as an art form. I'm talking about the way hip-hop is engaged with from a social political perspective. And part of this is tethered to a longer narrative about US jazz artists having come to Europe and having done tours and also having been sent to Afghanistan and Asia and bits of the Middle East, that there are times when strategic essentialism becomes an institutional strategy. So that's about as academic as I'm going to get. But just suffice it to say that I don't hate hip-hop. I actually like hip-hop, although my love of hip-hop is diminished slightly because of the repetitive tone that I've encountered here, and especially at Heesterveld. But I'm gonna go more into that later. The other thing I want to just to contextualize this conversation say is I don't adhere to one definition of black culture. And when I speak about black culture, I'm speaking about it as we encounter it in consumer culture, mass media. I was reminded this week that Nigeria is the largest black nation in the world. So we would extract then that this must be the hub of black culture. Or maybe Brazil, which has the largest African diaspora in the world, but that's not the case. The notion of black culture is dominated by an American narrative. And I believe that this ties to consumerism, to the way that we experience black life is often through movies, through imagery. And I want to focus on that definition, which is to say that I'm not speaking about the reality, I'm speaking about the hyper-reality. So what we know of black culture comes from outside. To tie it back to this notion of romanticism, our cues are provided by the outside world. Now, let's see if everything is working according to plan here. Ah, yes, culture is a product. Culture belongs to no one, and yet culture is a product. And it's something that if you work in subsidized social or cultural projects, you know how culture is often seen as something that we have to sell to the public, we have to encourage people to engage with, so we find different ways to market it and perhaps even make it a little bit more sexy and identifiable. Because our pleasure of consuming culture is derived from our identifying it as something knowable. So when we consume black culture, I want us to think about what gives it pleasure? How do we recognize it as authentic, particularly in the context of the post-colonial neighborhood? In a previous article, I wrote about the demographic makeup of this neighborhood here, where we are now. And for those of you that aren't aware, I'll just give you a brief sketch. 40% of the population here is from Afro-Surinamese, Afro-Caribbean descent, and 20% is Ghanaian. Now, this is unique to Holland, right? We are situated now in the largest black neighborhood in the Netherlands, and has become historically known, if you review the media on the Bijlmer, the term black, very literally black, I'm translating literally from Dutch, is often invoked. So I started to think about what does this mean in terms of how we feel about the people who live here, the cultural products that emerge from this area. And what I noticed over the course of the past 10 years is that things tend to be done at a relatively low level, cheap. The level of sophistication that I seek is sometimes found in small places like this, but when I look at city projects, I see that there is a dominant narrative that comes also from youth culture. I'm not entirely problematizing, and I don't think city officials are evil. Let me just also say that. I think that they're trying. And one of the issues that I have is that I think some of their notions about culture come from the realm of consumerism and what they consider to be familiar to black men in particular, who are the targets of social and political projects. So I mentioned in the article that in 2011 there was a shift in the government, and we had a rather liberal government shift towards a rather right-wing government, and the first thing they did was cut a lot of cultural projects that were either working with ethnicized communities. So NINSE, where I worked for many years, was lost all of its funding. NINSE was the National Institute for the Study of Dutch Slavery and its Legacy. So we lost our funding. Everyone was fired summarily. But this had other cultural ramifications, one of which was that 41 of the 47 cultural platforms that provided a space for hip-hop also lost their funding. And what came into the vacuum was a series of social and cultural programs that were designed to target disenfranchised youth in the urban periphery. So instead of coming from cultural pots, now subsidies were coming from political participation pots, social welfare pots. So a lot of programs that worked with keeping kids clean, off drugs, were using hip-hop as a medium to connect with a demographic. Now, strategically, I understand why they chose this particular path. But what I'm interested in terms of rhythms is what kind of rhythms were recreated and maybe reified in this process. So I have a few images to share with you on this front. We will tie it very, very, very quickly to the sociological and the academic. It's hard for me to stop thinking academically. I'm going to try, though. So the social production of urban space, we see here three examples of. The first being abstract space is space that is created by designers, architects, city planners. Right? And then we have the lived space. This is actually a picture from the Amsterdam support. People engaging everyday life. And the final space that I'm most concerned about is representational space, which is this notion that literature and entertainment, movies tell us what urban life is like. And the real world is a perfect example of this because it's very much a fabrication. Right? It's a tool to get us, we want to see what happens when these people get real with each other. That was, I think, the opening montage was what happens when, right? We create a little petri dish. And so this is supposed to indicate to us what urban life is like. And we see it's very driven by youth culture. And I think that this connection of youth culture and urbanity needs to be problematized a little bit more as well. So I mentioned earlier, I believe that tropes are rhythms. The trope is the isolation of a single rhythm. So the problem for me is the repetition of the trope.
I don't know what the word trope means.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, so a trope is in literature, a trope would be like a literary device in which a very similar situation occurs again and again. So we can see it as sort of like, well, you know, in the theater when somebody has left some pills and then somebody else says, oh, I have a headache, and takes one of the pills and suddenly madness ensues. There is a sort of rhythm to this story. That's a trope.
So the pills are the trope?
Well, no, the idea that there's a mix-up. That one person leaves something and the next person comes in and doesn't know what's happening. It's a literary device.
Okay.
But more specifically, when I talk about hip-hop, it's a way of explaining hip-hop culture, right? Is we have a narrative about these things. And symbolically, there are certain elements that remain the same. The gold chains, the hats, the frowning. These are tropes that signify authenticity. So yeah, tropes, I mean, that notion of tropes comes from post-colonial studies, essentially, that they're literary devices that are used again and again sometimes to tell, you know, to explain a situation, but they can also be used to explain maybe the presence of a particular group of people and how they live, and what they're up to. This is a movie that was made in the 90s here in Southeast. You can see the iconic modern structures in the background, but they have a different association this time because they're coupled with symbols that I think are familiar to anyone who's a film buff would know John Singleton, who made Boys in the Hood. Yes. So we're looking at the same era of cultural production, and you see symbolically we're speaking to a certain population. So Bollicher Blues is a story about drugs here, set in Southeast. I won't say it's a great movie or anything. You know, you're just looking at an image of the poster that was used to promote this particular film. Why do I think this is important in a historical context? Because I think it freezes us in time. And I see this imagery again and again. This is from the 90s. I'm going to show you some more recent imagery where the same kind of tropes are reproduced, right? So that we rely on the absence of a historical context here in order to explain why these people are here. In this case, they're looking to me very familiar as a kind of like an African-American narrative that would be used to describe how black life functions in an urban environment. But this is the Bijlmer. This is Southeast. So we disrupt the time-space continuum in this sense because we remain frozen in time. We are frozen in this particular narrative right now. And it also becomes the way that we tell stories about this neighborhood. And so you will see certain notions coming back again and again. That's why I say we are in and out of time. I like this term, achterstandswijk, right? Because we are saying in some ways we are backwards, right? We are behind. And I'm particularly interested in this because I feel the opposite is true. I actually think this is the most progressive area of Amsterdam. I'm very happy to have lived here for 10 years, and I feel that we're actually at the forefront of a lot of discussions and not behind. So I'd love to see a shift in terms of how we present ourselves. So I'm saying we here because I'm talking about people who work on social cultural projects, people who work with the city, who engage in the production of cultural products. Okay, where do tropes come from? If we go back to the earlier notion that culture is a product, and it's a product of consumer culture, and we know readily that hip-hop has certain symbols that identify it as authentic, one of which here I think is violence, because there's a bullet hole right in the center. I'm not, again, blaming this particular artist or anyone who appreciates his work. For me, it's much more about the representation of a particular type of black masculinity that's being presented over and over again, that's readily identifiable. I'm not so interested in the individual appropriation of these narratives. I understand that that's part of this story. And I mentioned in my article that there has been quite a lot of attention to the individual appropriation of this narrative, particularly from the field of criminology. What I'm interested in is how institutions appropriate this language, these symbols, to achieve a higher goal, which may be targeting a particular demographic. So it's based on a certain essentialism that we believe this is common to a particular lifestyle. It's based on branding, consumerism, and myth. I think one of my experiences in living in Southeast is that there are a lot of myths that linger, that are repeated frequently, and when you hear them, your heart sinks a little bit, because partially myths don't emerge out of nowhere. We know this, and I'm always actively trying to combat myth in my own way, but I think this is romanticism as well. I think myth and romanticism are friends. I use the concept, Guy Debord's concept from the situationist school, the ethnic spectacle. And this is something, a term that I read that really resonated with me when I think about Southeast and the transformations that have taken place here from the 90s onward, that the way that we promote this area, ethnicity is a product. It's to be experienced and we consume it. So we're very glad to come and have an exotic experience in this space. But one of the things about this movie in particular, Alleen maar net de mensen, this is another Dutch film that was filmed here in Southeast, and I'm going to show you a trailer, because it also has those iconic high-rises in the background as well. We see that over and over again, and how that imagery has now been connected to a notion of the ghetto, when in fact they were modern structures that were created by the architects of that time. So we see them through a different lens in this case. But the film presents a socio-spatial hierarchy of value. It contrasts life in the Old South part of Amsterdam. In particular, this is a Jewish family, and their son has decided to actively pursue Afro-Surinamese women, who he sees as being more sexually available. And so the movie plays out of this two worlds, and the worlds are very much contrasts in the film. So I'm just going to show you, and I would like to say, yeah, it's in Dutch. There's no translation, but I think you can get a sense of what's happening just from the imagery in the trailer. And for the Dutch speakers, maybe we can have a little moment of translation after the fact.
Heb ik een dikke kont in deze schoenen?
Nee, je hebt geen dikke kont in deze schoenen.
Hoe lang zijn jullie nu al samen?
7 jaar en 3 maanden.
We beginnen met de filter fish, de haringbonbon. Daar mag iedereen er 1 van pakken.
Ik kijk de laatste tijd alleen nog maar naar een heel ander soort vrouw.
Hallo, schoonheid.
Afrikaanse dames. Is het jouw interessegebied?
Wij willen tangen! Hoe donkerder ze is, hoe dichter ze bij de natuur staat.
Ik ben in love.
In love? Op wie, als ik vragen mag?
Rwanda.
Rwanda, is dat een Hollandse naam?
Je ziet er bling bling uit.
Dat weet ik niet hoor, met je bling.
Ze is 23 en ze heeft 2 kinderen. We eten op de bank.
Op de bank?
Nu ga je vertellen dat Rwanda je enige chick is.
Ja, Rwanda is mijn enige chick.
Weet wat jij bent? Een speculaas! Een blanke die te veel met zwarte omgaat. Je neemt alle slechte gewoontes over.
Als je zo doorgaat met het verlummelen van je leven, dan gaat de geldkraan voor jou dicht.
Niets krijg je meer van me.
Rot op naar waar je vandaan komt! Met je outside alleen maar net te missen!
Okay, I think this is a trope, right? Does this elucidate? It's a vehicle from which we have. Oh, gee, I just got rid of everything. Yeah, that was not my objective. It's recognizable, even if you don't speak the language, that there is certain imagery that's pervasive. The way that we tell the story of these two parts of Amsterdam is very interesting to me in this narrative. right? And also because there's a contrast in terms of the behavior of the individuals involved. The other thing that I found a little problematic, that I don't want to focus too much on the fact that it is a Jewish family, but this idea of the ghetto being a modern, let's say, you know, sort of a 70s, 80s, 90s construction. The ghetto in Amsterdam originally was the neighborhood from which, you know, the Jewish diaspora was expatriated. So a ghetto in this sense takes on a different meaning, and I think that meaning has become dominant in terms of how the media sees this particular region. And some of it has to do with the building structure, but mostly it has to do with the presence of a particular demographic. And this is what I want to problematize. This is the things that concern me, that there is an imposition happening in all of this. So I quote the activist and theater maker Quincy Gario here when he says, fictionalized spectacle in and of itself is not an issue. It's the manner in which the spectacle is used to uncritically reproduce some of the most damaging historical stereotypes of men, and that appeared in print. Just to give a kind of continuity to the narrative, and that they're not images I chose myself, but that were actually used in publication to describe what's happening in this neighborhood. So the first image is from 2013, and you can see, well, we have young people, and they are shot from a particular angle, which to me is kind of indicative of the real world style. Lots of men wearing caps, folded arms. These images are, to me, not congruent. This is a very different image of Heesterveld in 2018, and that's because it's a very different place right now. That the transition of time here can be seen through the representation of this particular creative community. So ghetto romanticism in this sense for me is this longing for the authentic, and we see here imagery, symbols that signify authenticity. It was originally formed as a hip-hop community, a place where creativity would flow from the streets, and this was a strategy from the Housing Corporation to attract a new young population, mostly students, and they say specifically students were a target population, to live in a part of authentic Bijlmer. So what signifies authenticity in this first image? As opposed to the second image now, some of us actually had lunch here during the seminar, and we all enjoyed it, and it's wonderful that there is something along these lines, except for the fact that this is a new moment when we see the transition is now complete. We have a very different population of people living in these spaces. The hip-hoppers are gone, the rap artists are gone. There were 5 studios which produced hip-hop, all gone. And I want to take a step back and look at the original population who lived there before it was a creative community. Now, these images are from a booklet that Imira produced in 2007. In 2007, they decided that they were going to destroy Heesterveld completely and rebuild there because there were a lot of structural problems with the building. These were the people that were living in the building up at that time, and Imira had this particular photographer photograph them because they were supposed to come back. This was supposed to be a transition. For them, they were told, you will be allowed, after we've just, taken this building down, we're going to rebuild buildings, and it's going to be for the middle class, first generation immigrant, primarily Surinese, Antillean, and Ghanaian. So all of these families were relocated, and then in 2008, Imira said, well, we're not going to go through with the project because of the crisis, but we're going to create a hotspot, cultural hotspot, community. And in order to transition this space rapidly, they chose a particular trope, a narrative about youth culture, hip-hop, making things happen on the street, in order to attract young white students who wanted to live in the Bijlmer, but wanted something recognizable and identifiable, right? So now these folks essentially have been forgotten in this narrative. And of course we could go back further to the 1960s and say, well, Heesterveld was once a farm. It was an actual farm where people had to travel to do heavy labor. This area was largely a marsh in the 1950s, and it was drained. And of course, so in terms of archaeological finds, it might be interesting to go back then as well and look at Heesterveld in all these transitions. But if you Google Heesterveld now, you're going to increasingly not find these kind of images, right? Because the narrative is now that it's a hotspot. It's mostly students living there. They're looking to engage with the corporate park next to it, so it's along a heavily trafficked metro line, and there's still a lot of money being pumped into that project, but to whose benefit? This was also from a recent article in The Parole, and I didn't choose, this was the image that was associated with this particular article, so I'm not having fun here. This is an art reviewer for The Parole who wrote an article about Heesterveld, and it was in 2018, called From No-Go to Hip and Happening. And I found this last quote of his very interesting, because what he says is, what I see, or what I find remarkable, is that I'm in a cultural hotspot in the heart of the Bijlmer, and it's largely white audience. And that's okay, because at least Anusha Nzume, who's an activist, is not here to tally. I found this painful, but at the same time I was very glad he said it. Because I have a similar experience now when I travel to Heesterveld. I see a very different population of people who are enjoying these facilities. And so space is being transformed rapidly. And we still have this issue in Southeast for those who live here of spaces that are racialized. When I go to certain events, I will encounter certain types of people. And I find this problematic. So this is something I think as activists we need to work on. We need to think about our networks and broadening our networks, and how do we create spaces that are more egalitarian. We disrupt with new rhythms. This is a picture. These are two stills from a performance art piece I collaborated with the artist Ray Zijlstra at Heesterveld. So we created an entire day that was about emancipation, and the objective here was to be disruptive. So we hired this wonderful actress, Toos Free, to imagine that she was released from slavery, and how would that have felt on that particular day. So she began at the metro station in Boulevard, and she walked towards us throwing sugar and yelling that she was free, and experiencing all these kind of things that would seem like abnormal. You know, you were really out of your element watching a performance art piece take place in a space that was transforming rapidly. And I think this was really a powerful moment for me, because I did try to get some funding for this particular project, but it was conceptually so far outside of the realm of what city officials at that time could understand. They didn't understand why we wanted to do performance art in this place, because usually it's just barbecue, or usually it's just, you know, a hip-hop concert. And this was something outside of the realm of everyone's comfort zone, which I think was good. And I wanted to end on that point, because I put the question back to us as artists, designers, academics, is we are attracted to the rhythms of the street. So what responsibility do we bear in the narratives that we choose to follow? What happens when we disrupt the rhythms of tropes? And whose knowledge is defining the cultural products that remain? Thank you.
Thank you.